Good morning students. Welcome to our computer class. In today's class we will discuss about exception handling. This is the class which I am taking on your request. Otherwise this exception handling is not at all important for your ICs. But still 1 or 2 mark short question may come in ICs. For that also we have to learn exception handling. Before starting exception handling we need to know what is exception. Exception is runtime error which may occur during the execution of the program for some unexpected situation. And if this type of error occurs, program cannot continue its execution. It terminates after showing some auto-generated system message, which is difficult for the user to understand. So if we handle this type of exception in our program in our own way, we can display one appropriate message for the user where user can understand what actually happened, why program is not executed and why program stops its execution. But system generated message means it will display where exception has occurred, in which class, in which function, in which line, what type of error it was, when error has occurred, why error has occurred, this type of information with error code. This ordinary user cannot understand. Now different type of exception may occur in our program. File not found exception, class not found exception, array index out of bound exception, division by zero exception, input output exception. For this different type of exceptions, we have different classes to handle. For division by zero error, we have one class, arithmetic exception, to handle the exception. For input output exception, we have IO exception class. For file not found exception, we have file not found exception class. So these classes have different functions to handle this type of exceptions. So what actually happened when exception occurred in a function? Runtime system checks for exception handler in the function where exception has occurred. If the exception handler is not there in that function where exception has occurred, it will check the exception handler in the call stack, means from which function this function has called where exception has occurred. Suppose exception has occurred in ABC function and this function has called from main function. So if exception handler is not there in ABC function to handle the exception which has occurred, it will check the exception handler for the current exception in main function, because main function was the caller function for this ABC function. If no exception handler is there in the main function to handle this exception, then the runtime system will send that exception to the appropriate class which can handle the exception by showing all type of error information. Understood? Now when we will handle exception in our code, what we will do? So this is my function, suppose. Here I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines. Now in this 7 line, I suspect that these 2 lines may generate exception during execution. So what I will do, I will use a keyword called try. Try. This is the keyword which make a block which always checks for exception. So these 2 lines we are enclosing in try block to check for exception. So during execution after second line, when this line will execute, try will check the exception. When this line will execute, again try will check for the exception. So if any exception occurs in try block, the exception objects will be created which will be thrown out of this try block. That need to be handled in our code. As I have written try here in my function, we have to handle the exception in my function only. So these 3 lines we have to write afterwards, after writing a block called catch. This is another block which will handle the exception which has occurred here in the try block. So here we will write the code to handle the exception. And this catch block will catch the exception which has occurred here in the try block. How? Using an object. So here I have to declare one object of appropriate exception class which can handle this exception. If you don't know the name of the appropriate exception handler class to handle this exception, you can use exception class, which is the superclass of all exception classes. This superclass object can refer any subclass object. So here exception E. So this E is nothing but an object of the exception class which will catch the exception which will occur here in the try block, and here internally we will handle the exception using E object. We can display here meaningful message for the user what exception has occurred. So during execution what will happen? First line will execute, second line will execute, then in try block these 2 lines will execute. If no exception occurred here in the try block, then catch block will not execute. Then this 3 line will execute, and after that the function terminates its execution. But if exception occurs here due to the execution of this line or this line, then control will come here to execute the catch block, and this 3 line will not execute. But in these 3 lines, if you need to execute this line which is very important even after the exception, then what we will do? We will write that line in another block called final. And then last 2 lines. So these two lines will never execute if exception occurs. But if exception occurs, then also at least this line will execute because it is written here in the finally block. So finally block is always executing block which code will execute regardless of any exception. So these are three blocks: try block, catch block, finally block. Try block is a block which always checks for the exception in its code. Catch block is a block which can handle the exception which may occur here in the try block. So if try block raise any exception, catch block will handle that exception. So this is exception handler in my function. And this is finally block which is always executing block that will be executed regardless of any exception. Now against one try block we can write multiple catch block. Suppose in these two lines 3 or 4 type of exception may occur. One catch block can handle only one type of exception. Now to handle 3 different exceptions we have to write 3 catch blocks. So after one try block at least one catch block we have to write, but multiple catch blocks also may come after one try block. And one finally block we may write, may not write. This is optional. But if you write try block you have to write at least one catch block. Understood? Try, catch and finally. This way in a function we can handle exception in our own way. Another way also we can handle exception where we will write exception handler class. In our own class we can write few functions to handle my own exception which is not considered as exception by Java system. So in our syllabus we don't have exception handling at all, but still try, catch, finally sometimes come in ICSE. That's why I made you understand what is try, catch and finally. And I will give the notes of this try, catch and finally as study material with this video. So you must download the study material and go through this try, catch and finally. So today up to this much. I hope you understood this. Till our next class. Bye. Have a nice day.